Morning, everyone, and happy to be here in a sense that I'm also currently a visiting senior researcher at the Estonian National Museum. So I'm having dual roles of being a professor in Malmö and a visiting researcher at Estonian National Museum. And I have quite a long time to talk to you about the work from the perspective of the collaborative work that I've done with the museum. And when Lisi was mentioning that I've been with the museum quite a long time, then it's 14 years, actually. We started in 2008 when we first decided that, so my PhD thesis that I defended in 2006 was about internet users and media studies, internet users. I was very interested in technology and how technology can be useful in society. And then I thought, I could do something with my research that would benefit, not just indirectly producing more knowledge and making society more clever, but also, can I do research? Can I do something that would be of direct benefit, so that I could do something applicational? And I've been searching around different kinds of ways of doing applicational research. I've been engaged in policy work, involved in Estonian internet information society policy making a little bit, and I've been engaged with research trying to develop new technologies. But then, because of my good colleague and co-author Pille Pruulmann-Vengerfeldt, is a research director here at the Estonian National Museum. She was then inviting me to consider whether the research that we were doing around internet, audiences, media, could we make this useful and applicable for museums as well? That was the sort of beginning of a project that we then formulated into a research application, got funding from the Estonian Science Fund, and had this super ambitious and super vague title, which was called Museum Communication in the 21st Century. Of course, in 2009, we knew everything that 21st century is going to be, not. But we had this ambition that museum communication needs to be somehow considered or reconsidered or redefined in different kinds of ways. So that was my starting point. And being a media researcher, I've also defined myself always as an audience researcher. And that's one of those interesting things that with museums, which again, by my definition or by many other people's definitions as well, museums are media makers. Museums make media. They make oftentimes very slow media, but they communicate. They put up an exhibition. They use exhibits, they use storytelling techniques, they use different ways of conveying a message. So museum as an institution that conveys a message, and then different museums convey messages about different things. They convey message about culture, they convey message about people, they convey ideas about what a nation is, for instance, or they convey ideas about what culture is. They convey ideas about what kind of history we've lived, but also they convey ideas about what kind of futures are possible. So museums are media makers. And more often than not, they are making these interactive, three-dimensional, blended media, where the media is oftentimes also physical. So that you have this chance of seeing things, and it's all not always only about the text as a written word, but it is as a combination of things. The spatial experience, the items, the objects at display, they are all together make a message. And then when museums are so engaged in making these messages, I think, and I argue, that they should also be engaged in understanding how these messages are received. And that's where my audience studies interest comes in and says, you know what? The fact that we say something, the fact that we try to convey something doesn't mean that it's received the same way. Because people who receive these messages come from different kinds of backgrounds. They come from with different kinds of preconceived knowledge. Some messages that museums convey will be easier to recognize. Others will be more complex, more subtle, will not be recognized as such. Because can you think about, for instance, if you walk through a museum hall and you see an item that you also have at home. Your reaction to that item, the story that that item tells you, is very different than looking at the things that aren't from your home. So your reaction as an audience, among other things, depends on what things you have at home. And can you now imagine making media that conveys different messages to people who might have stuff at home, might not have stuff at home, might have experienced some stuff, might not have experienced some stuff. So it becomes increasingly complex. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't sort of try to understand how audiences read museums. And again, as a media studies scholar, we make things oftentimes very simple to us. So it's text, no matter what the text is. The text can be video, can be an image, can be thing, can be space. That's a text. And then reception is oftentimes just annotated. It can be viewing, it can be listening, it can be participating. But it's a museum as text, audiences as readers. Can be, again, audiences as viewers, audiences as listeners. But it's this kind of like, just to sort of like, these are standing words for the time being. So museums as media makers and people in the audience who are receivers of the text. And so whose media do museums then make? Whose voices do they convey? And there again, if you're, let's say you want to write a book, you're an author. You write your words, you put down the ideas, that becomes your text. But does it? Is it always just your text? Or is it a text that is a stand-in for your culture, for your experience, for your life that was before you came to put down these words? And again, any literary scholar would of course argue that it's not just a single text from you as a single author in isolation, it's a text from your culture. So museum makers are making texts from their culture. But they also, in addition to being just single text authors, they also are authoring these texts because they have the obligation to speak for different groups. And again, if they are state-owned, state-funded museums, they're also having a mandate to speak for that state. That's also one of those reasons when we see, for instance, in recent times in Europe, we see right-wing politics raising their heads. It's also museums that get impacted, and also museums who then have to go in and start rewriting these texts. Because we write the texts of our culture, and when we write these texts from our culture, there can be people who say, yeah, but this part of the culture or this part of our history, I don't want to be represented like that. I want it to be represented in a different way. So museums are oftentimes considered quite authoritative voices, writing texts, writing our cultural history, or if we're in a cultural history museum, or if we are in art museums, they are also writing art canon. They are writing what is considered art and what is not considered art. So museums are quite powerful voices in saying what gets to be said about a culture or about a society. Museums also get to say what is to be said about our culture and society by defining what do we collect. Cultural history museums, in collecting, in labeling, in organizing these collections, that is also a way to collect, systematize, label culture. And that is one of those reasons why museums today are quite much struggling to understand what should we collect about today? Because we're living in this culture, and that sort of collecting of contemporary culture, collecting of contemporary times is quite a challenging thing that museums all over the world are trying to solve in different ways. So, okay, we are in this powerful institution that has quite a lot of societally agreed mandate to collect and display and organize culture. So these organizations or these institutions are also quite powerful when it comes to teaching us about different roles, different organizations of society. And just quickly, this one. So because museums can teach us about what society is all about, in democratic societies, we'd kind of hope that they would also teach us about democracy. And museums can teach us about democracy in different ways. They can put up a display saying, democracy is this. They can put us up a display of history, how, for instance, women got vote. Last year, Sweden celebrated that women had been having the right to vote for 100 years. And that was a huge sort of do. So it's a celebration of democracy to put up a historical exhibition about women's voting rights, for instance. So they teach us about democracy through historical stories. But they can teach us also about democracy through letting us enact democracy in different ways. And here we can go to a sociologist, Anthony Giddens, who talks about we should be democratizing democracy itself. And how do we democratize democracy? We can democratize democracy by taking it out of traditional political institutions, like parliamentary elections or local municipality elections, or things which we traditionally associate, where we kind of have almost an equation mark between politics and democracy, that democracy is bound to the sphere of politics. But one of the ways in thinking about it is that in order for democracy to function in the society really, really well, we need to take it away only from politics. We need to practice democracy in different other spheres. And why not in museums? So the idea then is that we can see museums as a great sites to practice democratic knowledge making in sort of broadening the base of whose voices are heard in the media that museum makes by engaging different groups. So we're not only engaging the groups of professionals who have the authority because they have knowledge, they learned about things, but we can also engage voices of regular people. Because arguably, who else should know about the culture than the people who live in that culture? So we can bring in different voices and co-create knowledge in the museum, because museums are already important media makers for these people. So I also argue that museums as sites for co-creating research are really interesting because they have already oftentimes really deeply established links with the communities. We are here in the hall of Alisa Mora, who, among other things, after the Second World War had played an important role to gather and organize a correspondence network. So people who would send in their notes about the museum to the museum about their lived experiences. So as an ethnographic museum, Estonian National Museum is obliged and interested and wanting to connect to the whole community of different people who live in Estonia. So that would be one of these ways of looking at it. So different museums to a different degree. When you have a very local museum, then the community is oftentimes smaller. If you have a specialized museum, then your community is also oftentimes specialized. But museums have a role and often have a community that they need to speak with. And then with sort of modern day museology, museums would also have, for instance, trouble connecting with their community because their community is disjointed. They are having colonial collections and their communities are far away, or they're having colonial collections and their community is at a position of adversity with a particular museum or the particular state that museum is in. So community is not always there waiting to be engaged. Community can also be in a sort of point of contingency or point of trouble with the museum. But it's, in principle, it's there. And I think museums are also great ways of places where we can make knowledge because they have such a great space for doing different kinds of actions. So we can, of course, co-create knowledge with the communities by speaking with the communities, by letting them write to us, send letters to us, answer questionnaires, send in objects. But as museums themselves are media with kind of like three-dimensional interactive media, engaging spaces and objects and so, the museums as spaces for knowledge creation can also be taking advantage of that kind of three-dimensionality in a sense. So the knowledge creation can happen not only through verbal communication, but can happen by making some things together, by gathering around doing, dancing, singing, knitting, handicraft, different kinds of ways of not only speaking about knowledge, but also enacting that knowledge in different ways. And at least in the Estonian National Museum, I've had the pleasure of having an institution that is deeply research inclined. So museums are interested in making knowledge and systematizing knowledge and collecting knowledge. So it's not only just about being here as an institution, but also sort of knowledge making is deeply embedded part of that institution. Not all institutions in society are like that, but museums are in that sense in a privileged position. However, and that sort of gets me to go back a slide, what constitutes as knowledge in different institutions is not always, or for different people, is not always super straightforward. And I'll be the first one to admit that academic knowledge, the knowledge that is valued and appreciated at higher educational institutions, is oftentimes increasingly further away from the knowledge that's at the other end in society. So the knowledge that's needed for survival is not always the knowledge that's best for publications, just to make it very crude distinction. But also knowledge that's in the academic side is oftentimes oriented towards being critical, towards societal fabric, towards institutions. So criticality is oftentimes almost like a hallmark of great academic knowledge. And in media studies, where I come from, that often means that we are criticizing the media institutions. We're saying they're not doing a good job. We are saying they're doing a poor job when it comes to representations, for instance. And as a museum scholar, one could also go in and do critical research about museum exhibitions and say, museums are not doing good. There are oftentimes, and this is not about Estonia National Museum, but they're oftentimes poorly representing female knowledge, especially history museums. European history museums are full of white, uptight men. They are oftentimes poor at representation of different classes, oftentimes poor at representation of different kind of minorities. I work at Malmö, and Malmö University is a very new university. But Malmö as a city has a history of being both a harbour city, but also a lot of industrial city. And the post-Second World War Malmö history is basically built on two industries. It's built on the industry of shipmaking, and it's built on the industry of textiles. And who worked at the Second World War, post-Second World War textile industry? Migrant women. But if you look at the sort of more, let's say, if you would have looked at Malmö history about 20 years ago, it would have been all about ship industry and men working there, and much less about the textile industry and migrant women working there. So Malmö Museums has taken its mission for they basically have written it in their strategy to work systematically on highlighting female histories. So that they are really trying to gather, display, and make a designated effort to work on these underrepresented groups. But if I'm a critical researcher, I go in and do critical reading of the displays, I will say the museum is only representing, and again, oftentimes, white, middle, and upper class histories. And as a critical researcher, my role would oftentimes stop there. And I would work away. I would publish a paper that would get cited. I will have a sort of great reputation as a scholar. But has the institution been helped by that kind of criticism? Sometimes, not really. Oftentimes they don't even read that publication because that's just not where their knowledge domain lies. So by having these kind of like oftentimes opposite direction drawing knowledge domains, critical knowledge and applicational knowledge, that kind of idea that we can work in towards co-creating knowledge also across different societal institutions. We can co-create as academic researchers or as people who will be receiving our academic degrees. We can co-create knowledge not only with lay people, but we can also co-create knowledge with different institutions in the domains that the knowledge will be valuable and applicable to them. And one of the challenges is that because the different institutions have so different societal mandates, and unfortunately also because what is valued in the critical knowledge domain is still sort of your publications, your citations, your ability to raise funds, all these kind of things. The distinction becomes oftentimes increasingly big. But it doesn't have to be. There are ways in which we can make it gather the knowledge interest and gather the points around these different ways. So, and one of the ways in which we can do this, to gather this different points of knowledge, is to do different kinds of action research. Research that does something, that acts different kinds of ways. And as I've just sort of gone through this idea of museums as great sites for co-creating research or co-creating knowledge, I'm also arguing that it's a great place of not only two knowledge creators meeting, it's actually a place where three different kinds of knowledge creators can meet. It's a museum as an institution, museum as a sort of public institution with a mandate for democracy. It's the people, it's the communities, but it's also the academic oftentimes critical, oftentimes blamed to be in the faraway ivory tower kind of knowledge. And then kind of meet in these kind of 3-4-way collaborations by doing something together. And what I want to use, I hope the rest about like 15-20 minutes, I want to argue that this kind of knowledge that can be co-created through these ways is also possible to be super good quality. And that's why I'm going to use Sarah Tracy's idea of what makes quality in a qualitative research. So she took a large-scale literature review and tried to understand what is quality in qualitative research. Again, in quantitative research, we often talk about validity, we often talk about, I'm completely lost what are the things we talk about in quantitative research. But and then people do make the mistake of trying to say, okay, we have to do, for instance, validity in qualitative research. But that's not really what makes qualitative research representation, for instance, or representativeness. That's not really what qualitative research is about. So qualitative research needs its own vocabulary to talk about quality. And I thought if I take these 8 categories from Sarah Tracy and try to sort of argue that the research we can co-create with the museums and people, or in museums with the people, that this can be a research of real good quality. But at the same time, the quality can be defined in different, sort of through different arguments. So I'm going to go through each of these 8 categories and hopefully make my point even a bit more concrete. So worthy topic. Who gets to judge what is a worthy topic in society? Whose sort of worthiness do we decide upon? And here, if we talk about action research as a way of doing qualitative research, the aim of the study comes with a sort of action research aims to study the system and collaborate with system members to change the system. So it's basically saying, let's come back to the museum displays, for instance. We consider what we think we need to change with the museum displays, but then we study together what we think about museum displays. And then it's a question of what kind of groups we study them together with. Is it museum professionals we take as action group? Or is it a museum professionals with wider community? Is it with academics or without academics? But it's, let's say we focus on studying something where we think we might have an inkling that it might not be the best way we've done it. But we'll do a systematic study, we'll do a systematic analysis of what could be wrong, we reflect upon the results, and we set about to change it. So action research is always about changing something. And worthiness of the topic comes from the fact that the group who is acting the action research says, yes, we agree this needs to be changed. Action research doesn't have to be in a museum. It can be in different kinds of groups or institutions. It can be about understanding group dynamics. It can be about different ways of doing things. But it's about not just stopping at the critique, but it's also using the same critique and it's using about the literature, using theory, using other people's knowledge to act change as well. And the focus is then on learning and co-learning as a way of generating new knowledge. It's also about respecting that different parties in action research come with their experiences, their knowledge, their prejudices oftentimes. And together when they go about sharing it, new knowledge may be born. It's also oftentimes the action research where the topic is challenging when we do academic research, because sometimes what is worthy topic for an action organization, there is so much research about it already, and it's very hard to justify, like, why are we doing, because again, why are we doing research about this? There are books written about it, there are articles written about it. It's just about sort of like, let's just change. Let's not sort of do that through that action research because we already have so much knowledge. But that kind of goes against the grain, and that's one of the problems with action research, that again, if it has to correspond, if it has to respond to only one set of knowledge making standards, that it can be in trouble. How to rich in rigor. So good qualitative research is rich in rigor. Good action research is also super rich in rigor. And this is as I mentioned, we had this super ambitious project, Museum Communication in 21st Century. And to be quite honest, only midway through the project, we were realizing that we were doing action research. We were doing research in collaboration. We had people who were working at the museum, but also doing their PhDs in the university. We had this mixed group with people with dual roles. So, and it took us, again, we were about midway through the project when we realized, oh, action research is a good way to describe the research that we're doing. It also took us midway through the project to realize, in order to understand what we have been doing, we should be better at documenting it. So document some more is a hard-learned lesson from our own failures, where we went in and started doing things and only in hindsight tried to then capture some of the knowledge that we had. What were the presumptions? What were the expectations? Why did we choose this and not the other? Well, how did we go about these things? So some of these documentations were maybe not best done. So any kind of collaborative co-creating knowledge project that one embarks with, I suggest documenting in different ways, in different modes. It can be photos, it can be videos, it can be your own notes, it can be minutes from the meetings. Document and keep them in as systematic way as possible, because sometimes we don't really know what is going to come out at the other end. And then it's good to have that with it's good to have a lot of documentation. Be systematic about any kind of research that you do, in terms of it's good to try to, again, on the one hand, it's good to start with a system and then go in and start sort of filling the gaps in that system. In other ways, it's actually really good not to have that system pre-imposed, because, again, if you come from, for instance, an academic tradition, you take a pre-existing theory that comes up with certain categories, that comes up with certain keywords and explanations about the world, and then you take that and try to apply that through action research in a institutional setting. The result may be that you miss something because you've been too systematic. But you impose someone else's systems on the place where you should have actually tried to listen to their systems first. So it's a bit of a sort of a tricky approach, but combine with reflection any kind of systematic approach that you have, and try to be flexible. So one of the things that we learned when we did our Estonian National Museum project was that making plans is super important. Detailed planning, really, really good. Also, then 2 weeks later, 1 month later, to change those plans is also very important. So it's also, you can't be rigid with your plans, but you have to make them in order to understand where you're going. So this idea that I'm doing super qualitative approach, I'm doing grounded theory, I'm doing something from the bottom up, hence I go out with any plan, is not a good idea. So to make plans and then change plans is usually much better, and then document why did you have to change your plans. So that would be. And it's oftentimes then when we do action research, the reflective practice is then left to the academics in the bench. So reflection is then left to the people who are generating academic knowledge, maybe generating publications, writing these things. But it's also the reflective practice of the other co-creators of knowledge that can give you super valuable insights that will help, for instance, with organizational change or learning, but it has to be included. And academics are super good at listening when they think it's time to listen, but then they're also super good at ignoring when they think that it's now the time of knowledge creation. It's like kind of on-off modes. But in this case, it doesn't work like that. So you have to keep your listening really on and really encourage different ways of engaging these listening practices. Good qualitative research is sincere. So you really have to go in with a sort of idea that you want to do, and you're honest and sincere in your approach, and you're honest and sincere in collaboration with other people. And as knowledge claims are never neutral, it's kind of autobiographical, and self-reflection helps to contextualize, and it helps to sort of be honest about your own motives and be honest about your own sort of desires. Why are you doing this research? Action research, credibility of action research comes with working with practitioners, comes with working with the community, with the people. It's not working on them or trying to do work about them. It's doing work with them. And that's not always easy, because practitioners have all the other things that they also need to do. They also need to do practice. So academic research or collaboration with research or collaboration with knowledge creation oftentimes gets pushed aside. So I have a student of mine who was doing action research collaboration with teachers, practitioners, teachers. So they came together, they established what kind of things that they were going to learn about. They wanted to create a learning community around literacy and different kind of digital literacy skills. They identified, they decided how they're going to work about it. And I think about half year in, the learning community slowly went back to work, basically. Because all the teachers had so many other things to do that sort of systematically engaging in improving their digital literacy and documenting and doing that as part of a research project was not really very high on their agenda. They were like, can we just do so that you teach us? And we attend a course and we get signed off and we have the knowledge and we can go and just continue doing our work. So all this kind of let's co-create, collaborate, practice together. That was ain't nobody got time for this. So it's also to respect that achieving that credible results by working with practitioners is not always super easy, because again, there are different agendas at work, but also that knowledge contributions are evaluated based on their credibility for different people. So what is credible knowledge in my books and what is a worthy knowledge and worthy topic in my books as an academic might not be the same as what is credible and worthy knowledge in my books as a museum practitioner. So I also worked a bit with Malmö museums, and I've been in a few of these kind of seminars where I've talked about democratic co-creation, participation. And I thought I've done a very like hands-on, super practical, like we just let's talk about how we do things. And then yeah, it was very nice. It was just very big words and very abstract and very academic was the feedback that I got back. And I was like, okay, that was nowhere near academic. So that kind of finding the balance of what is considered credible but also actionable knowledge in different groups is not easy. So it's just something to keep in mind. Any kind of good qualitative research needs to resonate. And that kind of idea, what is resonance and who does it need to resonate with, is another point of this kind of contestational challenge. And again, as action research takes knowledge creation to people, sort of democratization of knowledge within the knowledge-making domain as well, that kind of resonation with the democratization is something that can be super important. But it's also the challenge and opportunity here is that, as I said, what resonates with academic literature is not always what resonates with people or what resonates with listeners or and it's kind of like, again, the resonance with theory building may not be the same as resonance with practice. But good kind of research, and then it's also about resonating in writing, because oftentimes we need to present the research that we do at the end of the day through written word. And then to choose the written words that would resonate with the listeners or readers, that would really sort of speak in good ways, is not an easy task always. So again, words that I might choose that are in my head super applicational might not be resonating with the listening audiences at all. Same with significant contribution. Significant to whom? Significant in what context? But it's also then the action research idea is not only about understanding what we are going on about, but it's also managing to affect the desired change. So the contribution significance may vary. It may be that you do get the desired change, but you don't necessarily get much theory building done about it. Another situation when we were engaging in what in hindsight can be called a little bit of action research, style research, was that we were collaborating with a company that was developing new software. And then we did interviews with people who could be potentially seen as future users of that software. But because software didn't exist yet, it was this kind of hypothetical future-making interviews that we were doing. And our project partners in the company, they were super excited about it. They thought the research was great. They got so much new knowledge about it and they got so interesting insights and they were so excited about it. We thought the research was super boring because there was like almost nothing publication worthy. There were no new insights. Everything of this was already like documented. Again, there was abundance of literature about it. There was really nothing new that we could say about it that would be sort of helping theory generation or helping to understand the society. So for us, the significance of contribution from academic point of view was poor, to say the least. For the participating company was super valuable. That significance of contribution was there for them, but not for us. So again, if we are collaborating with different kinds of knowledge domains, and if we are trying to generate knowledge across different kinds of institutions, the direction of it is not always super self-evident. That's a tricky one. In the sense that it's a tricky one that we have to talk about. All the kind of things that we do has to be ethical. And of course, as sort of well-versed academics, we have an idea what is ethical, and we are really working towards, for instance, relational ethics, building and maintaining respectful relations, and so on. But two challenges that come to mind, and one is a bit odd one, maybe super Sweden specific. But in Sweden, one of the things that you're not allowed to do as a researcher is to aim to change other person. So you're not really supposed to be changing someone's mind. Or it's okay to change someone's mind towards better, but it's not really okay to change someone's mind towards worse. And then the question of, like, if I try to make things more democratic, am I changing someone's mind really for the better? And then, again, there might be authoritarian dictators who say, no, that's actually changing things for worse. So that's one thing. But the other thing is also a co-authoring challenge. If we're working together with a smaller or larger group of people co-creating knowledge, who gets to be an author when we, for instance, publish something together? Is it everyone who's participated in a workshop where knowledge has emerged? Is it only the sort of lead academic author? How do you divide that authorship? And how do you then divide that authorship so that it doesn't become a burden for the participating communities either? Because again, as I reminded you, community participants often have other things to do as well, not just go about writing. But at the same time, when you want to do really ethical research, you want to engage them in knowledge making and knowledge co-production also through the written word, which might be too challenging. So not so crystal clear when it comes to how to do best ethical practice in this case. My final point about quality in qualitative research is about meaningful coherence. And this idea that a good qualitative research has an output that is, among other things, meaningfully coherent. That the research output, the result, is presented in a coherent way. A thesis that you write has to have coherence throughout the text, for instance. But a good quality research needs to then be also presented in a way that's approachable and meaningful for the audience. And that pushes, oftentimes mostly academic researchers, to seek different ways of presenting their knowledge and seek different ways of distributing their things that they have learned. And again, if you have to do, like, one of my own challenges was, like, if you have to condense a 4-year PhD study in a 20-minute presentation, how do you maintain coherence and meaningfulness there? Or how do you then maintain coherence and meaningfulness if you have to make an infographic out of it, or a blog post, or a set of tweets, or other ways in which we can communicate knowledge across different modes and different media? And again, coming back to the media making part of the museums, the knowledge making, the co-created knowledge can also need to be coherent across a 3-dimensional multimedia organization like museum. That is my last point that I wanted to make, and left very few minutes for questions and discussions, but hopefully still there's some space.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting, insightful presentation. Are there perhaps questions from the audience?
I have a question. I don't know how should I speak in relation to the microphone. No, it picks it up. Okay, good, perfect. Thank you. So thank you for your presentation. It was really cool and inspiring. I have a question on something that is not probably central to your research or to your presentation, at least, but something that you have mentioned quite a few times. So you've referred to the audience or the visitors of the museums as a community. And I was wondering, how do you define it as a community, given that, especially in the major museums, in the, I don't know, tourist towns, for example, most of the visitors are actually people who don't live in this area, or also maybe don't belong to the same culture as the museum and is representing. So I was wondering, how do you fit it in, the community concept?
And it's to say, to be fair then, that museums have connections with the community, and community and audiences are not the same thing. They're different things, different groups. That can be that the community the museum is relying on, for instance, as a source community, that community is almost absent from the museum as a visitor community. And that's a challenge for the museum to which they have to work and address. It can also be that audiences are, and again, to a certain extent, audiences are always members of different communities, but these might not be the communities museum addresses as a community. So if I come to a museum in Paris, if I go to Louvre, for instance, I am a tourist. I still have my membership as a community. I'm still Estonian living abroad. I'm still part of an academic community. So I have different kind of community memberships that I will always take into the museums, and that I will always use to interpret what museum offers to me. But museum has no idea of my community standings, and not always does museum also need to take a stance towards my community-ness. But Louvre, for instance, might take a stance towards my belonging to the broad European community, for instance, and might want to address my Europeanness in that communication, or might choose not to. So museums can take their different, and again, to a certain extent, that's also something to be really said. You can't fight on all fronts, or you can't have engagement on all fronts. You can't have engagement across all the community memberships that people will bring to the museum. You can have a limited, selected, and it's what I think maybe museums need to do most is to strategically pick them. Not completely ignore them, that doesn't work. Engaging on all fronts doesn't work either, but strategically pick which are my communities of action or communities of collaboration that I really want to work with.
Thank you.
Maybe just one more quick question, if there is. Yes.
I wanted to ask, when you said in the beginning that the museum is a communication institution, what will happen if you say that in a communication researchers conference, where you have mostly maybe media researchers, or how in this context the museum will be taken as a communication institution?
I think again, if it's like this old saying: if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're a communication researcher, everything looks like a communication institution. So in that sense, communication researchers will not object at all. They will totally buy into that argument that museum is a media maker and museum is a communicating institution. It's indeed again this idea that what researchers in communication area do, which again, we as communication researchers, we think it's super useful and super applicational across all different kinds of fields. So again, bringing in that concept of audiences, bringing in that concept of meaning making from the audience side to the museum is, from our perspective, interesting, relevant, applicational. And again, I was thinking maybe in this audience, some people want to disagree. They want to say, no, I've completely gotten it. Museums, collaborations, community, I've gotten it completely wrong. And I absolutely respect that. It's a fair chance that I have.
Yeah, thank you.